Dale was right in the middle of his fourth inventory check of the week. 56 NATO rounds, to be exact, when the seismic alarms in his bunker started screaming bloody murder. Built deep under the Texas brush, this 20-year labor of love was currently shaking dust right off the concrete ceiling. But Dale didn't panic. Hell no. Beneath that thick, grizzled beard of his, a grin of pure, unadulterated ecstasy slowly spread across his face. The security feeds flickered to life. A silver drop pod had just smashed straight through his prized camo netting, and hulking alien troopers were already deploying energy barriers all over his private property. Dale set the ammo can down real gentle. Lycan strolled over to a steel locker stamped with the words Doomsday Bash. Well, it'll be damned. The day actually came, he muttered. With a sharp, metallic clack, he racked the bolt on his heavily modded AR-15. He strapped on his quad-tube tactical night vision goggles and shoved open the hatch to the hidden ventilation shaft leading topside. Welcome to Texas, space boys. Y'all are trespassing on private land, and the Castle Doctrine don't say a damn thing about intruders having to be from Earth. The cold Texas night wind whipped dry red dirt right into his tactical mask. Dale eased himself halfway out the vent shaft, resting the barrel of that AR dead steady on the lip's rubber grip mat. The crosshairs instantly locked onto a figure huddled by the drop pod's landing gear barely 30 feet out. It was an Imperial combat engineer, head down, laying some kind of pale blue energy transmission cable. The optical camo generator on its back hummed away, completely oblivious to the fact that the Reaper himself had just painted a bullseye right on the back of its neck. Dale slowed his breathing to a crawl. His index finger slowly squeezed the trigger. Crack! A red, hot brass casing jumped from the chamber and hit the dirt, kicking up a tiny wisp of dust. The Imperial engineer's energy shield didn't so much as flicker. All that high-tech garbage was absolutely useless against a good old-fashioned kinetic projectile. The 5.56 round smashed dead center into that matte black visor. High-grade ceramic shattered into a million pieces. Neon, orange alien blood sprayed all over that fancy cable. The engineer managed one garbled burst of electronic static before it planted right into a pit of red dirt next to the landing strut. Dale flipped the safety on and hustled over, staying low. His boots crunched softly against the gravel. He slammed a hand onto the back of the twitching engineer's neck, grinding that bleeding head deep into the warm, dry dirt. His other hand went straight for the square box clipped to the alien's waist, the portable shield generator. With a sharp snap of the magnetic lock, the palm-sized device fell right into his rough, calloused hands. He shoved it into a quick draw pouch on his tactical vest. Just as he straightened up, the wind carried something nasty, the high-pitched whine of micro-drone rotors, followed by the heavy clank of Imperial scout boots stomping across a metal bulkhead. Two glowing thermal signatures flared on the edge of his night vision, slowly sweeping his way. Dale instantly flattened his back against the vent shaft housing, his fingers hooking onto the anti-slip rungs inside. Slippery as a greased snake, he slid completely soundless back down into the bunker's main tunnel. Didn't make a damn peep. He backhanded the vent hatch shut, locking it in place. Gripping his newly acquired shield generator, he hustled over to the side corridor near the entrance. He shoved the little box behind a pile of busted oil drums and smacked the power button. A pale blue energy bubble flared to life. That bright, juicy energy signature popped right up on the scanners, more than enough bait to lure those two incoming Imperial scouts down the wrong rabbit hole. Bait set, he spun around and ducked around the corner of the main tunnel. His vest pockets were already packing a pair of M18 claymores. When he pulled them out, the metallic click of the safety pins was muffled by heavy canvas. Nobody heard it but him. He aimed both mines straight down the entrance tunnel, slapping them hard against the concrete walls. The kill zones overlapped perfectly, turning that narrow choke point into a blender. He strung the tripwire tight. suspended it right at waist height for one of those imperial grunts, about 1.5 feet off the ground. Dead center. Trap primed. Dale vaulted into the maintenance trench right behind the bend. He pulled down the goggles on his tactical mask. The muzzle of that souped-up AR was locked dead on the tunnel opening, his knuckle white on the trigger. His cheek rubbed against the frayed edge of his mask as a feral, wicked grin stretched across his face. 20 years of stockpiling. 20 years of digging. Turns out he wasn't prepping for nuclear fallout or the zombie apocalypse. He was just waiting for these shiny tin cans to waltz right in and play target practice. Up in the vent, metal boots scuffed against the walls. A second later, 2 sharp blasts of plasma fire echoed from the side corridor. Hook, line, and sinker. The scouts had taken the bait. But right on their heels came the heavy rhythmic thud of armored boots marching across the concrete floor at the tunnel entrance. Thump, thump, thump. Louder and louder. The first pair of heavy-duty boots, caked in surface red dirt, stepped right into the open stretch before the bend. The boot came down hard and fast. The nylon tripwire, dusted with red dirt for camouflage, snapped taut. Click. The striker slammed the primer on both M18 claymores. A hellacious bright orange shockwave tore through the tunnel. 700 hardened steel balls flew down that narrow corridor at 2,000 feet per second. The blinding energy shields on those 3 Imperial Marines didn't last a single millisecond. The pale blue barriers didn't even ripple as the shrapnel punched right through. Raw, kinetic physics just wasn't written into the Empire's fancy shielding software. The point man had barely raised his heavy plasma cutter before a wall of steel shredded his visor and chest plate. Pale green fluid sprayed all over the guy behind him. He collapsed against the wall without so much as a warning blip. The soldier in the middle instinctively twisted to dodge, and half his ribcage got turned into Swiss cheese. A glowing blue energy core popped loose from his cracked armor, rolling across the floor before clinking right against Dale's hidey hole. The last Marine in the back had just hit his comms button when his entire left leg got blown clean off at the hip. He slammed hard into the concrete wall, twitched twice, and went dead still. The deafening roar of the blast faded, leaving the tunnel choking on shattered armor and a mist of green alien blood. Dale leaned against the concrete trench wall, his shoulder numb from the shockwave. He wiped the dust off his goggles, swept the hallway with his AR for 3 seconds to confirm no survivors, then scrambled out of the trench. His boots slipped on the slick mix of gore and shrapnel. He caught himself on the cold rock wall, his eyes immediately locking onto the heavy plasma cutter. Still warm, still gripped in the dead point man's hands. Just as he reached out to pry the humming weapon loose, a shrill, ear-piercing electronic alarm blared from the bunker entrance. Garbled Imperial comm chatter bled through 3 layers of reinforced concrete, loud and clear. Dale spat a mouthful of gunpowder, laced saliva onto the floor. That wild, unhinged grin crept back up. Ain't that sweet? The Imperial pups are practically begging to boost a Texan's body count. Forgetting about the alien gun, he crossed the tunnel in 2 strides and yanked open a flush, mounted wall safe. He pulled out a Remington 870, the wooden stock worn shiny from years of handling. He fed a full tube of 00 buckshot, racked the slide with a vicious clack, clack, and let the heavy mechanical snap echo down the narrow corridor. All hell had broken loose outside. Snipes of Imperial radio traffic slipped through the cracks. The commander was ordering a lockdown of the entrance and deploying a micro-drone swarm to clear the path. A harsh violet-blue light bled through the seams of the blast door. A split second later, hundreds of pitch-black micro-drones squeezed their way inside. The hum of their nano-rotors was deafening. Red scanner lasers swept the tunnel, painting the concrete walls in blinding streaks, desperate to map the entire first level layout for the heavy infantry waiting outside. Dale pressed his shoulder into the concrete pylon at the corner, bringing the pump action up nice and steady. He watched the swarm pour in, waiting until the vanguard was practically spitting distance, maybe 10 paces out. Then, he gently squeezed the trigger. Boom! The thunderous blast sent a dense wall of lead flying out in a perfect fan. That iron curtain instantly shredded the entire drone swarm into carbonized chips and cheap plastic confetti. The wreckage rained down onto the concrete floor like hail, leaving nothing but the ringing echo of the gunshot bouncing off the walls. Hot on the swarm's heels came the deep, grinding crunch of heavy armor crushing brick at the entrance. Those massive footsteps pounded the floor, marching relentlessly toward the corner. Dale sighed, stepped, retreating all the way to the concrete dead end of the tunnel. Right there, mounted perfectly at eye level, sat his big red self-destruct button. Dale jammed his index finger down hard. The cold metal button clicked flush into the wall panel. Every ounce of high explosive wired into level 1 detonated at once. The reinforced concrete floor bucked up half an inch, sending a brutal shockwave right up Dale's boots. An apocalyptic roar ripped through the entrance. Load, bearing steel beams, snapped in a shower of sparks, bringing hundreds of tons of bone, dry Texas red dirt and bedrock crashing down into the collapsing tunnel. The 3 Imperial heavy infantry leading the charge didn't even have time to pull their triggers. Their fancy shields couldn't hold back a literal landslide for half a second. The electronic alarms barely squealed before a mountain of dirt crushed their armor flat, pinning them deep into the cracked foundations. 2 Marines trailing behind panicked and bolted for the door, but a massive chunk of falling concrete snapped them in half like twigs. Faint, garbled comms static leaked from the rubble for about 10 seconds before the whole tunnel went graveyard quiet. Dale leaned against the tunnel wall, nestling the stock of the 870 against his shoulder. He tilted his head, let out a smoky, low-pitched whistle, and spat out a wad of dust, caked chewing gum. He didn't waste any time double-tapping. 20 years of digging meant burying a few walking tin cans was easier than trapping feral hogs. He turned and spun the rotary lock on the level 2 blast door. He shoved 3 hardened steel deadbolts, each as thick as a man's thigh, into place. The heavy metallic clang of the bolts dropping into the grooves echoed like church bells in the pitch-black tunnel. He glanced over at his level 2 weapon rack, fully stocked with an arsenal of custom toys. But just as he wiped the grime off his mask, a deep, continuous bone, rattling hum started up on the other side of the blast door. Heavy energy gears spooling up, and it was getting louder. The massive 12-inch thick steel plate started cooking. A dark, red heat ring bloomed right in the center of the door. The high-frequency shriek of an industrial laser drill vibrated the loose gravel out of the wall cracks. The noise was so sharp it set Dale's eardrums buzzing. Dale tilted his head, brushing the red dirt off his cheek, and reached into a wall cache. He hauled out a heavily modified microwave oven. Head rigged 3 of these bad boys about 3 years ago, specifically for some end of the world cyber attack. Today was their lucky day. The silver-gray casing was mummified in electrical tape. 6 fully charged 9-volt batteries were daisy, chained to the back. Inside, the cavity was packed tight with scrap iron nails and shredded copper wire ripped from old alternators. It was a homemade overcharged EMP bomb ready to blow its lid. Dale crouched low, pressing the entire microwave flat against the inside of the blast door, lining it up dead center with the laser drill's burn ring. He used 2 rolls of industrial duct tape to anchor the corners solid. His fingertips brushed the blistering steel, and he hissed as it singed him. Spitting a glob of rusty saliva on the floor, he muttered, "Y'all just love kicking in front doors, don't you? Well, eat this, you glowing freaks." He unspooled the detonator wire and backed away, pressing his spine against the cold concrete wall at a corner 30 feet down. He peeked one eye out to watch his handiwork. The drill's scream was getting pitchy. Molten slag began to weep down the seams of the door. That harsh violet-blue laser flared brighter by the second. He could hear the alien engineers buzzing with electronic excitement, flanked by the heavy crunch of Marine boots waiting in the rubble. They were stacked up on both sides of the breach, weapons raised, ready to flood in the second that door dropped. Dale rested his calloused thumb on the detonator's copper contacts, his knuckles turning white from the grip. The laser finally pierced the final layer of steel. A blinding needle-thin beam of violet-blue light shot through the breach, striking the metal shell of the microwave dead-on. B-womp. A heavy electromagnetic shockwave smashed against the blast door, funneling straight through the drill hole. A torrential rain of short-circuiting sparks exploded on the other side. The heavy laser rig's cooling pump seized with a sickening crunch. The searing beam died instantly. The Marine's energy shields let out a dying sizzle before shorting out completely. Centuries of advanced tech, dead as a doornail in a fraction of a second. Every single piece of battery, powered gear, night vision, comm links, helmet HUDs, fried into a smelly, smoking mess. In the blink of an eye, the Imperial squad was plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. Dale had already flipped down his pure optical night vision goggles, having spent 10 minutes earlier letting his eyes adjust to the dark. To him, the tunnel was lit up in crisp, glowing green. 2 hyper-aggressive Marines had already charged over the molten slag heap into the room, blindly waving their plasma pistols. They were pulling triggers at shadows, shrieking in pure panic. Their electronic eyes were cooked. They couldn't see a damn thing. The Imperial Army had fought high, tech wars across the stars for a millennium, but they had never once tried blind knife, fighting in a muddy, claustrophobic bunker. They were hyperventilating. The first Marine's boot scraped across a loose sheet of scrap metal. Clang. Dale sidestepped like a ghost. He drew the Bowie knife head carried on his belt for a decade. The cold, hard steel slipped perfectly under the collar seam of the alien armor and slashed deep. Pale blue arterial blood sprayed right in Dale's face, warm and sticky. The bastard didn't even get out a full gasp before he collapsed, clutching his geysering throat. His alloy boots thudded against the concrete floor. Terrified, the second Marine squeezed off wild shots. A searing bolt of plasma grazed Dale's shoulder, instantly sparking smoke from his combat fatigues. Dale cursed under his breath. He ducked low, pivoting behind the flailing alien. His left hand clamped down hard on the top of the helmet, while his right arm pulled that razor-sharp Bowie flush across the exposed, fleshy neck. The alien's arms flailed twice before it dropped like a sack of hammers onto the dead engineer below. Dale wiped the blue blood out of his eyes and wiped his blade clean on the corpse's uniform. He leaned over, reaching out for the still, warm, perfectly intact comms helmet strapped to the dead Marine's head. Dale's knuckles gripped the locking mechanism and yanked. He stripped the entire helmet and comms module right off the dead Imperial grunt. The bitter, thin smell of ozone from the EMP blast hung thick in the tunnel. In the pitch, black void, only Dale's analog night vision threw out cold green outlines. Cold sweat stung the plasma burn on his shoulder. Every time he lifted his arm, a sharp needle of pain flared up. He flipped the helmet over to check the guts. The EMP had only fried the exterior sensors. The hardwired internal comms were perfectly intact. No shrapnel damage on the clips or the straps. Good to go. Dale adjusted the tension straps and slapped the alien lid on his head. His thumb clicked the tactical frequency switch on the side. 3 seconds of static hissed before the Imperial commander's voice blasted through, shaking with pure, unadulterated rage. All reserve units, divert to the South Sector subterranean water main immediately. Flank the bunker core from the rear. This primitive local has crippled our electronics. Shut down all energy shields and auxiliary systems. Breach the facility and reduce him to atoms. A garbled mess of acknowledgments echoed from the squad below. The reserves were already massing at the pipe entrance. Breach expected in exactly 2 minutes. Dale busted out laughing, his blood-soaked beard shaking. He whispered into the dead air of the comms, most polite invaders I ever did see. Thanks for letting me know exactly where to set the dinner table. He yanked the helmet off and clipped it to his battle belt. Wiping the last of the gore off his Bowie knife onto his pant leg, he turned and hoofed it toward the level 2 storage depot. The cold green glow of his NVGs washed over a stack of industrial fertilizer barrels and sealed diesel drums pushed against the far wall. The drums were coated in a decade's worth of Texas dust. Dale took long, purposeful strides. His bony, calloused hands gripped the iron handle of the lead barrel. Dale gritted his teeth and heaved. 200 pounds of fertilizer rolled off his knee and hit the floor with a heavy thud, shaking half a century of red dust off the ceiling. He wiped a bead of blood off his seared shoulder. Stacking 4 bags of fertilizer on his back and hooking 2 jerry cans of diesel in his hands, he hunched over and dragged himself down the maintenance shaft toward the south sector water main. The rusty metal cans scraped loudly against the rock walls, kicking up a cascade of loose gravel. The pipe reeked of ancient mildew and raw sewage. Dale dumped all the fertilizer right at the base of the tunnel. He used the butt of his Bowie knife to smash the clumps, then carefully mixed in the diesel at the perfect ratio, packing it into a tight mound. This spot sat directly underneath the load, bearing foundation of the Empire's topside outpost. It was enough juice to blow half the bedrock to the moon. He rigged a pull, friction fused to the homemade Amatol charge, and spooled out 100 feet of steel tripwire, walking backward toward the entrance. He pulled the line tight, securing the end to an anchor piton head driven into the choke point years ago. The Earth's crust had squeezed this section down to a mere 12 feet wide, just barely enough for an Imperial heavy assault mech to scrape through, without an inch to spare. Dale backed into a hollowed-out alcove head blasted out ages ago. He racked the Remington 870 again. That sharp mechanical clack rang in circles down the closed pipe. He pressed his NVGs against the freezing rock wall. The captured alien comms clipped to his belt were still spitting out Marine March orders. The grinding vibration of metal treads eating concrete crept up his pant legs, vibrating straight into his bones. Heavier and louder. The massive silhouette of heavy armor began to crawl into the pitch, black mouth of the pipe. The taut steel tripwire snapped, yanking the firing pin. The striker smashed the fulminate primer. 100 feet away, the tunnel erupted in a catastrophic, thunderous boom. A shock wave of red sandstone and debris came roaring down the pipe. Dale was already tucked tight into his spider hole, his back braced hard against solid bedrock. His ears popped and went completely deaf instantly. The only thing he could feel was his teeth chattering uncontrollably as the entire tunnel shook violently. The bottom half of the Imperial heavy assault mech got vaporized into flying shrapnel. That much vaunted energy shield didn't last a single second. Kinetic fragmentation didn't play by their rules, and half a ton of Amatol blast force literally pinned the machine against the tunnel ceiling. The twisted upper torso wedged hard into the newly blasted crater. Pale blue coolant poured from cracked armor plating, soaking the red Texas dirt at its feet. The shockwave traveled straight up the fault line, hollowing out the entire bedrock pocket directly beneath the Imperial outpost above. The ground began to heave aggressively. The shrieking whine of overloaded energy barriers bled through the fractures, followed instantly by the chaotic screaming of Imperial Marines. The entire half-buried outpost slid down into the collapsing sinkhole. Half the structure plummeted straight into the abyss. Rebar and chunks of alien composite armor rained down in a catastrophic shower. The red dust choked the air so thick it cut the pipe's visibility in half. 3 minutes later, the dust finally settled. Dale pulled off his crooked NVGs and wiped the gravel off his face with his sleeve. He spat another wad of gunpowder grit, gripped his salvaged plasma cutter, and gingerly stepped over the loose scree. The pipe exit was half buried in rock. That wrecked assault mech was lodged at an angle, barely 15 feet away. The blast had popped the warped belly hatch of the cockpit open just a crack. It was bubbling with leaking coolant, and a faint, high-frequency distress ping whined from inside. Dale clicked off the safety. He dialed the cutter's output power up to the max and slowly aimed the blistering hot muzzle right at the buckled weld of the hatch. He pinned the trigger. A violent blue plasma arc spewed from the nozzle. The superheated blade licked against the mech's belly armor. A shower of sparking blue-white slag rained down, sizzling as it mixed with the red dirt. Dale leaned back to dodge the molten spray. His boots crunched softly on the gravel. Nudging the goggles up on his forehead, a gruff, gravelly chuckle rolled out of his chest. 20 years of garage tinkering. You really think a pile of cheap space metal's gonna stop me? He cut a perfect circle through half an inch of alien alloy. Raising his boot, Dale kicked the hatch hard. The warped door clanged inward, smashing right onto the legs of the half-dead Imperial pilot inside. The bastard was still kicking. Its compound eyes rolled wildly in a bloody mist as its deformed hands scrambled for the sidearm on its hip. But the blast had fried everything. The pistol just let out a sad little fizz, short, circuiting without firing a single pulse. Dale reached in and grabbed the pilot by the collar armor. He dragged the 200-pound alien freak straight out of the cockpit, leaving a bloody trench in the gravel. The pilot's crushed windpipe whistled and wheezed. Dale stepped down hard, snapping its spine under his boot, leaving it to flop helplessly in the dirt. He reached back into the cockpit, his fingers clamped onto the scorching, oval-shaped power core. The explosion had rattled the locking brackets loose, and with a sharp twist, he yanked the whole unit free. A pale blue energy halo leaked from the seams, baking his canvas gloves until they smoked. Dale didn't even flinch. He just hoisted the 40-pound battery onto his shoulder like a sack of feed. Wiping the grime from his face, he looked up at the jagged shaft created by the cave in. Dull yellow daylight bled down from the surface. Faint, panicked electronic chatter drifted down on the wind. Dale clipped the plasma cutter to his harness, rested his right hand on his AR-15, and kicked the bloody mud off his boots. His canvas glove squeezed tight around the blistering alien power core. He tucked his AR into his shoulder and shimmied up the loose, crumbly rock wall, heading for daylight. The explosive shockwave had warped the old water main into a perfect makeshift ramp. Every step crunched on red rock, shattered mech parts, and dark green puddles of marine blood, sending loose gravel clattering down the hole. The captured comms helmet on his belt was just a chorus of screaming and swearing now. Dale ignored it. His fingertips brushed past a still, warm laser scar on the rock wall. That vicious grin crept back. These fancy pants space cadets had lived their whole lives without knowing what it felt like to have real dirt blow up right in their faces. Barely 10 minutes of climbing later, the twilight sun peeked through the opening. Dale flipped up his NVGs, squinted for a beat, and slithered out of the rubble, dropping flat into a patch of scorched tall grass. The wind tasted like ozone and cordite. Off in the distance, that shiny Imperial drop pod was half buried in the dirt, its silver armor coated in dust from the collapsed outpost. The Imperial commander was standing right in front of the drop pod's landing gear, back turned. Blue lightning sparked across his shoulder, mounted energy shield. He was screaming into a comm link, shaking with pure fury. I repeat, surface target zone is riddled with undocumented high lethality defense structures, requesting immediate, saturated orbital bombardment. Execute now. 2 remaining Marines flanked the pod, rifles raised. Their optical scanners were frantically sweeping the sinkhole. It never once crossed their minds that the enemy would literally crawl out of the rubble behind them. Dale sank into a deep crouch. He gently set the oval power core down at the top of the gravel slope. He leveled his iron sights straight at the landing gear strut, 30 feet away. Chomping down hard on an unlit cigar butt, his canvas, gloved hand gripped the cold steel casing of the power core. Head pulled this thing out of a mech belly half an hour ago, and it weighed as much as a prize hog. Searing blue light pulsed through the cracks, feeling freezing cold against his palm. The energy density packed inside that little egg was enough to blow the entire landing zone to kingdom come. The captured helmet fed him the commander's high-frequency shrieks. He didn't care enough to translate it all, just the words orbital strike. The alien bastard was cursing at a star map tablet by the pod door, completely blind to the brush behind him. Even the guards were still staring down the sinkhole, totally ignorant of the Texas crazy creeping up their six. Dale thrust his knee and swung his hips, bowling that core right down the red dirt incline. It rolled smooth, just like the strike he threw at the county bowling tournament back when he was 40. The glowing egg rumbled over dead roots and discarded energy mags, heading dead straight for the landing gear without losing a single ounce of momentum. The Marine on the left heard the crunching dirt first. He spun around, froze at the sight of the glowing object, and let out a banshee wail. His fingers fumbled desperately for his shield activator. The other Marine whipped his rifle around, finger mashing down on the trigger. Thunk. The core smashed directly into the hydraulic strut, wedging tight at the base. The blue energy veins inside the casing surged violently. Dale's sights were already tracking it, deadlocked on the output vent seam. The butt of his rifle dug deep into his shoulder. Pale blue shields blossomed in front of both Marines. Their rifles spooled up, glowing hot. Dale squeezed the trigger without a second of hesitation. A shiny brass shell flew from the ejection port, hitting the dirt with a crisp ping. The lead core round spiraled out of the hot barrel, cutting through the air, heading straight into the tiny glowing seam of the power core. The split, second crack of fracturing metal was completely swallowed by a towering blue fireball. 1,000-degree shockwave leveled half an acre of brush. A monsoon of red dirt and alien shrapnel rained from the sky. The 200-ton drop pod was sheared right off its struts by the sympathetic detonation. It rolled hard into the dirt with a deafening crash. Ruptured hydraulic lines spewed fuel, igniting instantly into a roaring blue blaze that licked the warped hull. The commander, who had been busy screaming for orbital strikes, was swatted out of the air like a fly and thrown deep into the smoke. His two bodyguards hadn't even finished cycling their shields before jagged steel tore them straight in half. Puddles of coolant and metallic gore spilled everywhere. Dale brushed the red dirt off his shoulder, slung the AR across his back, and pulled his canvas gloves tight. He plunged low into the choking, acrid smoke. His boots squished sickeningly against melted alien armor. Within seconds he heard suppressed, gagging coughs. The commander was violently puking yellow-green sludge. Half his comms visor was blown clean off, and his optical sensors were blinded with soot. He was blindly pawing the ground, trying to reach his dropped ion pistol. Dale didn't give him the chance. He brought a heavy boot down directly onto the commander's lower spine. Crack. The alien alloy snapped cleanly in two, drawing out an agonizing shriek. Dale whipped out a heavy-duty zip-tie head scavenged from the mech wreckage. With a flick of his wrist, he looped it around the commander's spindly neck and yanked hard. The plastic dug deep into the armor seams, squeezing so tight the alien's optics began to bulge. He hauled the commander up by the collar and pinned him against the flaming hull of the drop pod. Searing metal instantly cooked the exposed flesh on the alien's neck. The stench of burnt meat overwhelmed the cordite. The commander thrashed, kicking his long legs and clawing wildly. Dale dug his knee deep into its back, pinning the freak against the burning wreckage. His grip on the zip tie didn't yield an inch. With his free hand, he slowly reached down toward the pale, blue, glowing datapad clipped to the alien's belt. Snapping the clip with his thumb, the datapad dropped into his palm with a ping. Knee still buried in the commander's spine, zip tie still strangling its neck, he watched the bastard writhe. Its compound eyes twitched furiously as static, laced hisses bubbled from its throat. Pale blue blood wept steadily from the cracks in its armor. Dale jammed the datapad into the portable comms unit lying in the dirt and pressed the cold edge of his Bowie knife flush against the exposed seam at the back of the alien's neck. "You're gonna type exactly what I say, word for word," Dale growled, his voice rough as sandpaper. "Tell the fancy boys up in orbit. Surface riddled with undocumented, highly lethal technological traps. Total squad wipe. Outpost destroyed. requesting indefinite, full-scale retreat. The commander's eyes whirred as it tried to sneak in a distress override. Dale pressed his wrist down. The blade sliced deeper, spilling more blue fluid and sending the alien into violent convulsions. "Don't try getting cute with me. I just put 11 of your boys in the ground. I ain't against adding the boss to the pile." 10 seconds later, the encrypted transmission punched through the broken atmosphere, headed straight for the Imperial fleet in low orbit. Dale kicked the comms unit directly into the flaming drop pod. He reached inside his combat jacket and pulled out a 20-year-old Cuban cigar, his personal prize saved for day one of the apocalypse. He pressed the tip against the commander's blistering shoulder armor. A cherry sparked with a hiss, lighting the brown tobacco to a perfect, even burn. He took a long drag. The spicy smoke made his eyes water. Looking up at the Texas sunset, now painted a bruised orange from the cordite, he stood with his boot firmly planted on the Imperial commander's neck and let out a long, satisfied exhale. For 20 years, his neighbors called him crazy, said digging a bunker and hoarding ammo was a fool's errand. But today, these high and mighty gentlemen from the stars helped carve his vindication right into the dirt. He tucked the clearance pad into his chest pocket, grabbed his rifle from the wreckage, and slapped the commander's helmet. "You rest easy right here. Someday, when I get a little free time, I'll come back down and cut up that armor of yours. Make myself a nice new gun rack." Dale turned and ambled down the red dirt slope toward his bunker. Thick rings of cigar smoke drifted lazily up into the evening sky, cloaking the distant outline of the Imperial observation fleet sitting on the edge of the atmosphere in a hazy, pale gray fog.
Writing this story was an absolute gunpowder-fueled blast. The core idea came from a simple, absurd question. What happens when an unstoppable, technologically supreme interstellar empire crashes headfirst into an immovable, aggressively stubborn Texan prepper who's been waiting 20 years for any excuse to use his apocalypse stash? The magic of the story lives in that extreme contrast. On one side, you have these arrogant, sterile alien invaders who rely entirely on energy shields, complex algorithms, and orbital superiority. On the other side, you have Dale. Dale doesn't care about the galactic hierarchy or advanced energy weapons. Dale only cares about property lines, raw kinetic energy, and a well-placed improvised explosive. I wanted to capture that classic HFY, humanity, fuck yeah, spirit, but grounded in gritty, cynical, red dirt dark humor. This isn't a grand space opera about humanity uniting to build a super weapon. It's about one grumpy old man with a shotgun, some duct tape, and a rigged microwave absolutely dismantling an elite strike force because the alien supercomputers didn't account for raw physical chaos and pure human spite. Honestly, spending time in Dale's head was weirdly cathartic. There is something deeply satisfying about watching a guy solve a highly advanced intergalactic problem with blunt force trauma and a Cuban cigar. Thanks for reading, and I hope you enjoyed this little Texas-style doomsday bash.